So, hi everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of Supply Chain Talk. My name is Duncan Brock. I've got the pleasure of hosting today's discussion. I'm really looking forward to, as usual, great insights from our guests onto the topical areas of procurement and supply that we tend to get from everyone in these episodes. It's great for you all to join us. I'm really looking forward, as I said, to some real insights, and this time it's about commodities, commodity shortages, commodity inflation. Something that we're all facing, something that's a real challenge for every organisation, and really good to be able to sort of share some experiences and views on that as we go forward. Last week, we were talking about decentralisation of distribution and manufacturing, and we got through it. I have to say, those of you who are watching us live probably saw that we had a few technical issues. That happens, and it was a bit of a challenge, I think, as we went through, but we did get some great insights from the guests there, and I'm sure we'll be running that session again as we go forward. So look forward to that. And I was reflecting, actually, technology problems we all face. I mean, this is on a platform, it's hosted, it's always a challenge, but I was thinking back to some of the problems I'd had running conferences in the past. And actually today, in the Middle East, we're running the SIPS conference in Abu Dhabi. And I was having flashbacks to about probably 5 years ago now, where I was about to chair a conference in Dubai, and we suddenly got the message that we didn't have the appropriate license to run a conference, and I had to stand up in front of a whole crowd of the great and good of procurement and supply in Middle East, and say, sorry, we've got a slight technical issue. Can you wait for a couple of hours while we get the license through? So maybe it wasn't quite so bad, losing about 5 or 10 minutes last week on the Supply Chain Talk. And hopefully this one goes smoothly. Everything seems to be going well so far. So great to see everyone. We've got 3 great guests, really different experiences from different sectors, which I think will really help us to bring to life the challenges on commodities, but maybe the different slants that people are seeing in different sectors. So really looking forward to that, and looking forward to engaging with you. If you have the opportunity, please do use the chat. I've already seen a few people already putting comments in the chat. So Mark, great to see you again, and Thomas and James, really good to have you all back. And John, thank you. So please do add comments into chat, and we'll look for those. And then as we get into the main topic of the conversation on commodity shortages and inflation, I'm really happy for you to add any questions you've got. And I'll try and make sure that take the time to both review them and get the guests to answer them at the appropriate time. So please do use the Q&A, use the chat, engage with people as you go through. As a little incentive, we have this wonderful Supply Chain Talk mug, which is only being handed out to a handful of people. But at the end of the episode today, at the end of the show, I will look for probably giving it to the best person who's asked the best question, or added the right view in a chat that really helps us to bring the topic to life. So please do engage, and please do sort of help us to bring this as quite an interactive session as we go forward. So let's move on, and probably great opportunity to bring in our first guest. Our first guest is Alex Graham, who's the head of supply chain for Royal Sanders. So Alex, if you could join, great to see you, and welcome to Supply Chain Talk again. I think you were with us a couple of weeks ago, I understand.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me back, Duncan. I appreciate that. I've come back to see if I can get one of those mugs.
Okay. You don't get a mug for being a guest. You only get a mug if you're actually asking a good question along the way. But maybe twice on a show you might be able to allow to get one, Alex. So welcome to you. And Alex, maybe just for those who don't know, I suppose both you but also Royal Sanders, maybe just quick intro to you, and then we'll drop in and start to look at the news story.
Yeah, so Royal Sanders is in the UK. Is part of the Royal Sanders Group, based out of the Netherlands. And we're a large privately owned and equity owned company. We specialize in personal care. So this last 2 years has been a real strong period for ourselves. We found ourselves right in the heart of the pandemic, offering solutions to people. A lot of our products is like hand sanitizer, hand washes, or personal care kind of items. We're in the UK. We're based up in the northwest, and we basically supply the major retailers with products for retailer branded items.
Okay, that's great, Alex. Thank you, and thanks again for coming back and joining us again on the talk here. The way we run Supply Chain Talk, for those who haven't seen it before, is we the first half of the session we focus on a broader news article and topic, and then we'll drop into some specifics, more detailed discussions around commodity shortages and inflation. And the news item we've chosen this week is one that came from the Washington Post, and it probably summarises at a high level the problems that everyone's facing. I mean, it talks about the fact that prices are rising all over the world and leaders see no quick fix. And as I was scrolling through the article, I was looking at it, it says things like in the European Union, it's the highest level of inflation since the euro was introduced that we're seeing. Yeah. In America, the highest inflation for 40 years. And I think a theme we're going to come back to through this session is demand's ahead of supply. That actually we're getting a lot more people, economies recovering, demand's there, the supply situation still hasn't stabilized effectively, so therefore that's inflationary. We've got wage inflation running through. We've got the drivers of low carbon economy that may well feed into higher costs. We've got fuel and energy costs coming through, and that's starting to feed through. And we're now seeing interest rates, long-term interest rates starting to go up. I suppose you've got the injection of capital up front, which is feeding through, but now we've got inflation to try and whether or not interest rates can mitigate that inflation. I mean, Alex, it paints a pretty gloomy picture, I think, doesn't it, in terms of the situation we're facing and probably the situation you're facing within your business as well.
Yeah, it's I mean, this last couple of years, probably the last 12 to 15 months, actually, there's been a real challenge. It's almost been like a slow car crash. You can kind of see it coming. And it's happened all over the world. We had a very rapid cool down in production output because of COVID between February, March 2020. And you just have to look at a lot of the purchasing indexes, and you can see on energy and oil, all those kind of indexes, and you're seeing the output and demand was very low. And I'm sure that a lot of economies have basically reduced their capacity to be able to supply that demand. And as you quite rightly said, as the economies have opened up around the world, some faster than others, they have struggled to meet that demand, because you may have one economy that's still in a slow growth and exit from a pandemic, whereas you've got another country who's in the rapid demand phase, and it's trying to source from those countries and finding it's got some supply shocks.
I know it also talks about, I've talked about European Union up, America up. I think the article also talked about the fact that China's actually inflation rate is lower than it's been for a while. So it's not happening everywhere, but I suppose if you add into that the cost of shipping from China, you'd probably say that the actually landed cost inflation is still very high, even if the cost within the manufacturing base in China, as an example, isn't really going up dramatically.
Yeah, I think that's right, and certainly from our experience, the actual manufacturing cost, we actually saw prices spike in China straight after the pandemic. Right. And it was, I think, mainly driven by the fact that the capacity shrank quite quickly in China. People went home for the Chinese New Year, and when they came back, a lot of organizations in 2020 were looking to go back to work, and that wasn't capable. And there were multiple tiers and hierarchies within the supply chain that one partner couldn't buy from another partner, and so on and so forth. So the impact going up the supply chain was felt quite a lot. And that probably meant that because capacity was constrained, some of the Chinese manufacturers could increase their price in the short term. I think what they realized after the first 6 months is that was foolish, because all they were doing is encouraging people to look in nearshore rather than the Far East. So I did see prices come and stabilize, but then we had the shipping shock. And I was telling someone yesterday that we've seen that container prices have increased about 400%. probably since about Q3 2020. And it's absolutely crazy. And when you're talking about the landing cost, you're looking very carefully now, and you're going, well, my manufacturing cost is this, my landing cost is my freight cost is this, my landing cost. Is it actually cheaper with a strengthening pound against the euro to look at European sources than it is to go to China?
Mm. And you're right. I mean, that's sort of. I'm sure we'll get onto that in terms of that longer term sort of. And actually, it was the topic last week that we were talking about, that sort of focus on decentralization of manufacturing. You know, what do you look for in terms of the base there? I suppose I mean, I talked about some of the other things still feeding through: fuel, energy, potential interest rate hikes. I mean, what's your view? I suppose. I mean, the article says leaders see no quick fix. I mean, are you seeing this being a long-term inflationary game that we're in, and the challenges really in your business you're facing to plan and budget and decide on not just what input prices are, but I suppose what your what your prices are out to your customers?
Absolutely. A couple of ways I'd like to probably approach that question. I said how I see the inflation unfolding. I think we've got to look back to the start of the pandemic, and I've kind of written down here. I think there's 5 cycles for the inflation, and I think that we're probably in the 3rd one at the minute. So I think the first one was the freight inflation that we saw towards the back end of 2020 as markets started to open up. Then we started to see material inflation and direct input prices going through the roof. We buy a lot of bottles and componentry and things like that for packaging. And you look at polymers, for instance, and different polymers are going up at different rates. And they've just been on a steady increase. We go back to probably the summer of 2020, £700 a ton for PET polymer. And now you're probably looking £1,800 a ton, something in that region. So you can see that cost has massively been added. And we've had to have good partnerships with our customers and to try and work with them to try and reflect those rising input prices and what we can do. I'd say the 3rd cycle for me is energy inflation, and I think this is the one that we're right in the heart of at the minute. Starting to hear that there are some manufacturers who are putting surcharges on their invoices for energy. You can look at your material indexes from a procurement point of view, but now you've got to be tracking your energy inflation, and you've got to try and be looking to work with suppliers who maybe have got their costs fixed with lock-in tariffs on energy in order to mitigate price rises. And then the 4th one, which I think is really going to start to hit home April, certainly in the UK. Not sure about the inflation wage cycle around the rest of the world when it kicks in, but from April, I'm expecting. We also know in the UK the national minimum wage goes up. I think it's 6.6%. It goes up on the 1st of April. So I think there'll be some spiral in there, unless you work for the Bank of England, in which case you shouldn't ask for a pay increase, because obviously that's not the right thing to do. And then the 5th one, I think it's further down the road, is the impact of inflation from the green economy. And I think you touched on that about carbon neutrality and things like that.
It's great insight, Alex. And I think that those, you talk about it in the 5 phases in that way is great. And we will try and avoid any politics here and talking about sort of other people's views on the economy. But actually, what you described there was a really good description of where you are, but also what's still to come. And I think that's the scary bit almost, because I mean, oil price is now up towards about $100 a barrel, isn't it? And it still has climbed up and maybe has still some way to go. So we know that does feed inflation as well, and on top of the others. So quite a big thing to go through. Probably a good time to actually bring in the other 2 guests if I can, because I think it'd be great to get them to come in and give their perspectives. We've got Adam Smith, who's the director at ADS Procurement and Supply Chain. So welcome to you, Adam. And also we've got Toby Goneman, who's the president at Fusion Worldwide. So welcome to both of you. I'll ask you both to do quick intros. First of all, for those of you who are watching this, Toby, thank you very much for staying up late. He's based in Singapore, so it's after midnight now, I think, for you. So it's great that you put the time and effort in to join us today. So thank you. So Toby, I'll give you the chance to quick intro to you and to Fusion Worldwide, and then I'll come to Adam.
Sure. Thanks, Duncan. Yeah, no, it's a pleasure to be here. I don't mind staying up late for this engaging conversation. Yeah, so I am the president of Fusion Worldwide, and we are one of the largest global independent distributors of electronic components in the world, and you know, we specialize in the buying and selling of semiconductors, passive components, system level components like CPUs, memory devices, and storage devices. And our customers, you know, cover every business vertical, many different types of technology companies, and our sourcing is also global. And we buy from, you know, 6,000 different vendors, 4,000 different customers. And you know, it's exciting to join this conversation because we have a lot of visibility to different types of supply chains, at least in the electronic component space. So I may be able to shed some insight that's relevant to today's topic.
That's great. Thank you, Toby. And yeah, we'll definitely come and get your thoughts in a minute. And Adam, sort of quick intro to yourself.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Duncan. Yeah. So I spent the majority of my career working for aerospace and defence businesses. So in total, 25 years procurement and supply chain roles. And then back in 2019, I formed my own consultancy business. So I tend to focus on SME manufacturing. So I'm based in the West Midlands of the UK, and sure most of you on this call will know that it's a fairly big hotbed of manufacturing in the UK. So I support a number of clients. So at the moment, 3 clients, and just trying to help them out of some of the holes that we're going to talk about now.
That's great. Thanks, Adam. And so just staying at the macro level first before we sort of come into some of the specifics. I mean, Toby, you sort of said there that, you know, you're obviously worldwide trading on electronic components and seeing the whole dynamics around that. I mean, are you seeing the inflationary pressures in the same way that Alex was describing there, or how are you seeing that market and how that sort of fits this broader picture?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that jumped out at me about Alex's comments that I thought was pretty interesting is that he described, you know, this as kind of a car crash happening in slow motion, or watching a car crash in slow motion. And our experience, you know, in the technology side, in the semiconductor space, has been, I think, the opposite. It's been almost like a high-speed crash in terms of the, you know, the scales of supply and demand shifting the complete opposite direction very, very quickly, and, you know, catching a lot of people off guard. That's been, I think, the experience on the technology side. So it was interesting to hear, you know, Alex talk about it, and in his space, sort of being able to track, you know, from a more global macro, you know, tracking sort of the progression. For us, it's been a raging, you know, fire that's been very difficult to keep track of, and to stay on top of. So that's been our experience, that it's been more acute. Of course, now it's more prolonged. But you know, I think I got away from your question a little bit, but yeah, I mean, in our market, we're seeing hyperinflation. Technology space is very commodity, you know, has a lot of commodity characteristics, and so it's, you know, the more demand, the higher the prices. It's very much, you know, driven. Supply and demand gets to dictate the pricing in the market, not so much, you know, the manufacturers that produce the product. And we are seeing, you know, pricing, some alarming price increases, 10x, 20x, sometimes 50x, you know, the normal cost of components. So it's the shortage is, sort of frighteningly extreme. Obviously, it's been well documented in the news, how it's impacting automotive sector and many others. But it's still pretty severe.
And I also just to build on that, I suppose, Toby, looking longer term, I mean, clearly one way to overcome those shortages is additional capacity, additional production capacity. But we know how challenging it is to sort of build some of those sort of chip manufacturing plants and the expenses associated and the timelines associated. So everything I've read says we're probably still going to be in this for another couple of years at least in terms of the demand outstripping supply and the challenges there. I mean, is that what you're seeing, or do you think it's slightly different?
No, I think for sure it's going to be unsettled waters for a long period of time. I mean, it's got to start on the front end of the supply chain, and that's the wafer fabrication plants that take so long to build and so long to develop. And there's been much in the news and with government investment and with companies like TSMC, Global Foundries, Intel, and so forth, talking about investing in building new plants, but that's a 2 or 3 year thing before those are up and running. So yeah, we expect that the waters will be very choppy, for an extended period. Will they be at this hyper, hyper raging fire pace that it's currently at? No, probably not. But it's definitely a rocky road ahead.
Right. So, Adam, we've got a slow motion car crash and we've got a high speed car crash. I mean, what's your take? I mean, the aerospace and defense sector does go at a different pace. We do know that it probably takes a while for some of these impacts to feed through. But what's your take on this in terms of I suppose let's stay on the inflationary pressures, and then we can sort of come to the shortages as we go forward.
Yeah. I think where my experiences are different to both Alex and Toby is they've been particularly impacted by the pandemic. So I guess personal care and the space that Toby is in pretty much stayed as before, if not increased in demand. Now the industries I work in, so automotive and aerospace, we saw huge slumps as a result of the pandemic in terms of demand. And given that my clients are generally SME, you have a couple of issues there. One is their leverage is pretty much non-existent. So these are companies that are spending anywhere from 1 million to £6 million a year total spend. So their ability to leverage that with the supply base is pretty low. Picking up on one of the points Alex made about being in the energy part of inflation. Can we get some feedback on that, guys?
We're getting a little bit, but carry on, Adam.
I think I absolutely agree with Alex's point about inflation, and by default, the companies I work with are manufacturing companies. So the energy spend relative to those in the service industry is huge, and these increases are really hurting at least one of my clients. And the ability to pass that on to customers, I think there is definitely an acceptance more than I've seen for kind of 10, 15 years. There's almost an element of sympathy and realization that the cost pressures just cannot be retained in certain cogs within the supply chain. They need to go down through the supply chain, and ultimately it's all of us, the consumer, that will end up paying the higher price.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. And I think that sort of there's actually one question. I'm going to sort of change tack in a minute, but the question is coming from Paul Warner. Says, what can purchasers do to best mitigate against inflation, especially in longer term contracts? Probably, Adam, I'm going to stay with you on that first, because I think a lot of the SMEs that you work with are probably locked into some of those contracts. So if you're getting the input inflation going in, but if you don't have the ability to pass it on, then what do you do?
Yeah, I think the perceived wisdom that I'm sure we've all read articles to suggest this is the way forward is to resource to closer to premises or bring processes in house. Now, my view is that that's easy to say, but pretty difficult to do, particularly when we're looking at manufacturing again, which requires capital investment. So I think a couple of areas that that people can focus on, and I'll give one fairly small but fairly straightforward example. Again, manufacturing, but also in the consumer industry, we're all moving goods around the world and in country on pallets, typically timber pallets, whereas perhaps 2 years ago you would ship a truck of pallets with goods on from one end of the UK, let's say, to the other end of the UK. Once those pallets arrive there, then they would possibly be disposed of. So one of the things I've implemented with one of my clients is actually starting to return those pallets. So whereas that wouldn't have been feasible perhaps 2 years ago because the cost of doing so outweighed the cost of the pallets, that's now become something that's necessary, A, for price reasons, but B, for security of supply.
So, okay, so it's looking at other ways of offsetting the cost, recognizing the inflation's there.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I think maybe just to open it up to yourself, Alex, as well, and to Toby. I mean, advice for people who are facing these this inflationary pressure coming in, if you can't necessarily pass it on to your customers.
Yeah, it is a real tricky one because as procurement people, we're kind of coached and guided to try and break down how a product is constructed and then try to secure its constituent parts at the lowest cost, right time, etc., quality. And we do a lot of that work with indexes. We do it with contracts, and we do it with relationships. And when we do it with indexes, we may say, right, we're going to do a 12-month contract, and we may say, well, we may say it's a fixed price, in which case, great, it's a fixed price. So, or we may say it's on an index. If it's on a fixed price and you're in the current position, you can look at it one of two ways. You can say, great, prices have gone up, I'm winning as a buyer. My PPV, purchase price variance, is under control, and it doesn't mean necessarily that I need to pass it on to the end consumer. So that sounds great, but that is probably something that in the 13th month, when that contract ends, it's not that relationship is going to fundamentally change. So that's one thing. So I think even if you are locked into a fixed price contract, I think you still need to work with your supplier because they will be feeling the pain. Yeah, just like you will, and you've got to talk. The second way is if you're on an index, again, as a buyer, you're thinking, well, indexes have been quite stable, so they may flex up, they may flex down 5% here or there. I've got a trigger point, but you may be able to absorb that within your selling price. Yeah. And may be able to mitigate it and still protect your margin. But some of the actual price increases that we've seen, I mean, Toby was mentioning 10x, 20x, 50x. We've seen similar on different raw materials and energy and things like that from our suppliers. And the problem is you're on an index, you have to pay it to your supplier. And then you say, well, am I on an index with my customer? And a lot of customers are back in that first position we spoke about. They want a fixed term, fixed price contract. So you end up getting squeezed in the middle. Yeah. And that's where you get the margin erosion. So that's where you've got to work closely and collaboratively with your suppliers, internally with your teams, commercial, finance, etc. And then you've got to work with the end user, the end client customer.
Yeah. Toby, I'm going to come to you in a minute because I've just seen a great comment in from Olivia Brewer saying that we're seeing large increases from bigger companies such as 3M and Microchip who push SME businesses to the limit. These businesses are really battling to push the increases onto customers, which I think, Alex, was the point both you and Adam were just making as well. The lead times get pushed out without warning. This makes the purchasing role extremely difficult. I think we'd all agree with that. But I mean, Toby, just probably bringing you in there because I mean you're in a sort of distributor role, so you're probably you seeing it from both sides in terms of how you manage and mitigate the inflationary pressures coming through. And I suppose linked to that, I'm going to ask you too then, how do you cope with the shortages? How are you helping organizations cope with those shortages of components?
Well, I mean, the help we're providing is that we find the components that they need.
Right.
What we're not helping them with is relief on their inflationary pressures, because the components we're finding, we're passing our high costs on to our customers, and so there's really no way for us to mitigate that because we're sort of all slaves to the market in that sense, in the commodity space. But yeah, I mean, you mentioned the question from one of the folks online about microchip and lead times and doubling the pricing. I mean, it's not often that it's a seller's market or it's a manufacturer's market, or that we've seen manufacturers and suppliers emboldened by this shortage because the demand is and they don't always, they're not always in a power position in the negotiation, and so they're are there some abuses to that? Is there price gouging going on? Is there do it my way or the highway because I've got other people I can sell the parts to? Is there a lot of that? Yeah, we've heard horror stories. And then Adam was talking about the SMEs that he's working with, and how painful it is for them. I really feel like SMEs, it's kind of a double whammy for SMEs. SMEs are always victims in a shortage, and they're never first in line for allocations, but they also can't compete in an auction style market where parts go to the highest bidder. And the largest of the large companies right now are feeling the pinch in terms of supply, but they're also the ones that can throw money at the problem and reduce the impact, on their end. And so we're seeing a lot of money being thrown around by a lot of big companies to try to secure that limited supply that's out there. I'm sure there's some SMEs that are exasperated with, their inability to not only find supply, but when they do find it, the cost is so extraordinary it doesn't fit into their budgets. But back to the original question, hey, what can somebody in purchasing do to protect against this? Honestly, it's a little too little too late at the moment, but I hope one of the takeaways from this long-term shortage experience is some memory. I mean, we've seen a lot of shortages before, and we've seen all of the lessons learned during those shortages. There seems to be very quick amnesia that kicks in when a shortage is over. And then back to the non-shortage market priorities of increasing inventory turns and keeping inventories lean and reducing material and component costs, and really hammering your suppliers to only ship when you're ready for product and to get the very, very best price. Well, guess what? When the next shortage comes around, that comes back and bites you. And so I think the lessons learned during shortages need to be applied during normal times. And of course, there's balancing with shareholder pressure and all of these types of things. But there's a lot of penny wise, dollar foolish supply chain activities that occur in a non-shortage market that I think should get a hard look. When the dust settles on the shortage, they should recalculate their supply chain strategy a little bit to, maybe focus a little bit more on supply assurance through any market.
Yeah, I think that was one of the points that we were going to sort of try and pick up here, is talking about improving long-term planning, working better with your suppliers. And I think, Toby, you make a great point about amnesia. It's like you suffer it and then you forget about it and you go on to something else, but then you hit it again. And often the businesses haven't embedded those changes in the way they should have done to sort of get that resilience going forward. I mean, I suppose, Alex, are you going to suffer from amnesia, or are the things that you're already thinking about doing that you would embed for how you work with your suppliers and plan with them and get the right sort of, I suppose, relationship with them going forward?
Yeah, it's very difficult. I always said that 2020 there was a kind of cohesion that everybody was in this together. It was something that we all had to work through, and I felt that there was really good partnership. But it was very much a year about demand management for me. It was 2020. 2021 became very much the year about supply, and 2022 will be the year of inflation. And working with your suppliers, I think they all understand exactly where we're at. But everybody's got stakeholders and shareholders, and they've got margins which they need to protect. So, and that's what you've got to have, I think, open conversations with your supply base, saying, listen, I want to grow with you, I want to work with you, but at the end of the day, we need it to be as competitive as possible. So look at value re-engineering. What things can we do to take out? So Adam was talking about pallets and things like that. Great bit of advice. Anything that you're not just looking at cost price, you're looking at how you can maybe get the same service, get the same product, but take out some non-value added activities that maybe not looked at before. It probably sharpens the focus of what you need to look at.
Yeah. And I think Thomas Ahrens just put a comment in about long-term relationships with suppliers helps around this time to ensure both parties benefit. And I think you already touched on that, Alex. I think in terms of that sort of, if you're both tracking an index, then make sure that you're both tracking the same index and you apply it in the right way and you're fair and equitable on it. I think often when times get tough, that's where some of those supposed, move in step with each other gets lost because one party feels like it can squeeze the other. So that building that trust and working with people through the tough times then helps you when you're back in the good times again.
Yeah.
I mean, Adam, just on this sort of, I suppose, piece about how to improve and how to do things better going forward to offset both inflationary pressures but also shortages. I mean, what are you doing and what advice are you giving to organisations in this space?
Yeah, I think I'll pick up on a comment you made at the start, Duncan, in that demand is definitely outstripping supply, and much of that demand, or certainly a proportion of that demand, is unnecessary. And I'll go back to the beginning of the pandemic and the infamous toilet roll shortages that we had in various countries around the world. People just didn't need to buy as much as they were buying, so people were buffering, and that's been the kind of knee-jerk reaction in industry, where to try and secure supplies to service customers, people have been buying more than they need. And we have to remember we're all in our individual businesses, whether it be an SME or a larger blue chip business, we're all in a supply chain. So we need to understand what the true demand is from the end customer and feed that all the way down the supply chain and take some of this excess buffering of stocks out of the system. And I just noticed a comment from Thomas, the long-term relationships comments from Thomas. Again, a bit of a cliche, the fact that people buy from people, and I think where SMEs have a bit of an advantage there is they're not necessarily always sat behind a screen churning out MRP reports. They're people that truly understand their business, they understand the real demand, and they can communicate that down to the supply chain as well as backwards to the customer. So I do actually think there are some benefits to being an SME over being a large blue chip.
I think that's an interesting comment about that ERP piece and the interpretation of it, because as you say, if you got this sort of, what's it called, the bullwhip effect, you're building up a load of demand and that flows down through the system. But if you use that as being the baseline for future, you're going to end up with all the wrong inventory in all the wrong places doing the wrong thing. So it's interpreting it in the right way. And I think one of the other points was about how do you work better with other parts of your business, working with finance, working with your, the people who are actually doing the selling and the marketing and the customer interfacing piece of the business, so that you're getting that proper market intelligence through rather than just relying on the numbers. I mean, I think, Toby, when we doing a bit of prep yesterday on that, you were talking about that impact, weren't you? That actually you've got to add that intelligence into this as well.
Right. Yeah, I think what we were talking about is just sort of the inherent flaws that exist in a lot of the forecasting, that's put together by manufacturers, and one thing that we were talking about is that forecasting often looks at just raw data, past usage, sales data from a set period of time in the past, let's say the last 2 years, and then it tries to project, okay, for the next 2 years, we expect X% of growth. Let's use these numbers as a basis and then grow those numbers from there. And what the flaw is that we were talking about is that doesn't adapt for a different market landscape, a different inflationary landscape, a different geopolitical landscape, a different supply and demand landscape, competitive landscape, or whatever. You're comparing apples and oranges in a sense, because you're taking data from a market that may have been much different and plugging it into a future market that is going to be different from the market that you're taking the data from. So we were talking about that being sort of inherent flaws that exist within forecasting, which is, and forecasting is famous for being, more inaccurate than accurate. And I think that's, that could be a big contributing factor.
I think it's also interesting. I mean, maybe I'll come back to one of the comments. I think, Alex, there's just a comment there also about whether, maybe Adam and Alex, whether SMEs should combine their purchasing power. If you're looking to sort of cope with the shortage and cope with some of the challenges, is it good to come together? And it was interesting. We do some work with the construction sector at SIPS, and when pandemic hit and everything just went into shutdown, it's probably the first time collaboratively those companies came together to try and get the supplier base to reopen, to try and give some sort of demand and forecasting, to try and encourage the supplier base to get restarted so the construction sites could keep going. And I think that was a great example of collaborating for the right reasons. I mean, I don't know, what's your views on this? I mean, is it something that people should be doing more of, especially at the moment?
I think, yeah. So I'll go first, Alex. So I think it's an interesting question. It's something I looked at way back, sort of 10 years ago, and didn't quite take off for various reasons. The collaboration. I think two issues there. One is, by default, you're potentially thinking of collaborating with people in your same industry, i.e., competitors. So there could be a little bit of reluctance there, and I think competition, or unfair competition. And the exposure of confidentiality issues. So that's both within the supply chain and backwards towards the customers will probably be a barrier to that. I think without trying to do a bit of a sales pitch, I think this is where consultants do come into their own, because they do have experiences of different businesses in allied sectors, and they know what the true picture is out there. Whereas, as I said, by default, a lot of buyers and a lot of businesses are quite reluctant to share their information.
Yeah. I mean, Alex, what's your take on that?
I agree with what Adam said. I also take a bit of a step back in time and look at maybe Toyota and Japan in the 80s and things like that. And I think they had a network model called Kairetsu, where they basically looked at small, medium enterprises and basically forming this alliance together so that they could actually work in partnership and create this network that means that they could supply the big conglomerates and things like that. So I think it's possible, especially with today's technology. I think it's all about people will enable, as Adam said, to share information and work together. I think as long as you're not coming together to basically monopolize on the price, I think there's a very good reason for it. For instance, I look at the state of the pallet, just going back to what Adam was saying, in the UK at the minute. And it's not a monopoly, but there are certain companies who have a large market share, and they deal on a one-to-one basis with companies. Now, if a number of companies came together within an industry and placed their demand as a whole to different distribution and shipping points, that may push down the price because they'd have more of a negotiating stance. But it's one of those that people need to come together and be willing to start that conversation.
I suppose the other alternative is one way of I suppose combining spend is going through, I suppose, distributor model as well. Sort of, Toby. I mean, I suppose that's in a way you're doing some of that consolidation, aren't you? Because you look
for sure.
Consolidation.
Yeah. I mean, the Adam's little plug there, for consultants, I think was actually spot on. I mean, Adam provides for his clients a much clearer window into what their competitors or like companies are suffering from or doing, or solutions creations that they're coming up with, than they'll ever be able to get directly, because obviously competitors, especially in the same business vertical or whatever, they're never going to compare notes and join forces unless it gets to such a desperation point that they have no choice. And then on the distributor side, we're an independent distributor, so we don't have direct ties to the component manufacturers, and we deal with a lot of large consumers and OEMs that use those components. Well, they don't talk to each other, but I mean, that's a big part of our business, is that one manufacturer's problem may be another manufacturer's opportunity, and so matching up, finding the correct home where the parts fit in, are a better fit, and sharing information, from one large company to another large company within the same sector is very, very valuable to them. And so, that market intelligence that we provide to our customers is a huge, value add that we provide to them. And I think, similar to Adam, I mean, I think that's probably some of his first clients' questions are, well, what are they doing down the street? How does that other company deal with this, with this issue? And then, just applying some of those same resolutions. So yeah, I think spot on.
Yeah. And I think what we're finding interesting, even things like, doing the supply chain talk, sharing knowledge and insights. Everyone's feeling quite lonely. I think one of the comments very early on in this session was about whether the supply chain officers are going to have PTSD when they finish on this. But actually, but in a way, it does highlight the fact that everyone's struggling. Everyone's facing the challenges, and everyone's facing slightly different challenges in different companies. But as we just pulled up here, there's a lot of common themes and issues, and sometimes just sharing that insight, sharing that knowledge, learning from each other about approaches helps you to overcome some of the challenges you're facing. And therefore, that's why, like, this is great, because different perspectives, but all maybe layering up some of the things that people could do differently going forward. So that's really good. I know there's a couple of other questions that did come up, and probably I'm not going to answer Trudy's, because I think Trudy put a whole question about the whole imports to Germany and back again. I think, Trudy, that's a whole separate discussion around imports and trade wars, etc. Maybe we need economists on for that. But I think there is a couple of themes running through about we're seeing inflation go up. Will it come back down? If I look at the recent manufacturing index in the UK, I think probably almost every commodity was going up apart from PPE. PPE was probably the only one that had come down in cost, partly, again, demand and supply. We can all make PPE till volumes that we never dreamt of before, and now demand's dropping a bit. But actually everything else is still going up. So what's the sense of whether or not we're really seeing that sort of, will prices come back down again? Will we see that sort of prices start to drop? I mean, just high level view from you all before we wrap this up.
Well, I was going to answer your question first was, do we think inflation will come down? And then you said, do we think price will come down? And I think it's two different questions, because time will make inflation come down. Because if I'm comparing 12 months to 12 months, if I'm comparing in Q4 this year to Q4 last year, I may get 3-4% inflation. So I'm going to have a reduction. But if I look over a period of time, it may be 10% over 2 years. Right. So I don't think the price will come down, because inflation has gone up over a period of time. But I think inflation will come down depending on which cycle we're in.
Right. That's a really good answer, Alex. I mean, Toby, Adam, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean that was spot on. And this is a little bit not direct answer to your question, but I noticed a comment, from James Smith where he said, "Do you think that inflation expectations are becoming ingrained and almost expected?" I just thought that was a really interesting question, because I think that if inflation is sort of expected and accepted by everybody, it can also be used as an excuse or as a reason or as a justification for a higher price or a higher quote or a higher, just a higher cost on something. And this is something that hasn't, been brought up during the whole, COVID situation, but I think COVID has provided a very handy excuse for non-delivery or for shortage delivery or for longer lead time as well. Not to minimize the severity of the pandemic, but it has provided an out for people. And giving the excuse to your customer that, "Oh, sorry, we had to shut the factory down because we had COVID," there's really no way to combat that. And of course, that's believable and everything else. Has there been some of that going on so that they can then take, the product and shift it elsewhere at a much higher price? I've got to imagine that certainly there has been sort of COVID abuses in that way. And so to James Smith's point, yes, I think you're going to see the same thing with inflation, where whether there's inflation or not, you're going to see inflation in this person's prices because that's what people are looking to expect. So I just thought that was a very interesting comment.
Yeah, no, and it's a good point. And I suppose we've been through a very low inflation period, haven't we? So we've always got used to prices being pretty stable. And it's whether or not whether it becomes ingrained. And Adam, final comment from you.
Yeah, a couple of points really. I say Toby's point there about some suppliers abusing the circumstances. I'd like to think that those are the guys that will ultimately be found out and punished, I guess, when things calm down, because people have long memories. And I think really fundamentally on the question about whether prices will relax again, it's a supply and demand issue, isn't it? And we're already seeing central banks are raising interest rates to try and cool spending and consumption. I think that's going to continue for the best part of this year at least. And as Alex said, prices won't return to what they were a couple of years ago, but certainly the inflation percentage will start to calm down, and we'll find some equilibrium, I think, if that's the right word.
Yeah. And I suppose it's probably, we probably need to wrap this up, guys, because I think, unfortunately, we're running out of time. But I think, this is probably a topic we'll come back to regularly, because back to the whole theme here. And I think I think Alex, you talked about 5 phases of inflation that we're going through. I mean, the dynamics will change, and maybe the tactics and the approaches that we need to take will change as we go forward, as the markets change, and therefore just, again, learning from each other, understanding the different tactics that people can take, I think is going to be really important. So we're going to need to wrap this up. So I think Alex, Adam, Toby, really appreciate your time today. It's been brilliant, really good insights and perspectives, and great to hear the different perspectives from you all. I think particularly Toby, I understand you also Fusion Worldwide sponsored this episode as well. So really appreciate that as well. So thank you for that. Sure. Thank you to the audience for the chat and the QA. Some great comments that were coming through from everybody, and some really good, insightful questions. I was really torn between who to give the wonderful mug to, but I think probably Paul Warner asked a couple of really good, pertinent questions, which sparked off the next level of debate. So Paul, a mug is on its way to you, or will be once we sort out the supply chain problems. But Paul, great for that, and thank you for that. And obviously, Olivia Brewer as well. It's a really good question about sort of SMEs as well, which was a great question. So I can't mention you all, but thanks to the audience for participating. Next week's episode, we're going to focus on going digital for the last mile delivery. So a complete sort of switch probably into much more of the digital logistics supply, and how you could do that by going digital for last mile delivery. So hopefully you can all join us for that. But as I said, Adam, Alex, Toby, really appreciate your time today. It's been excellent. Thank you.
Thanks, Duncan.
Cool. Thank you.
Thanks, Duncan.
Thanks.